On the afternoon of July 12, 1789, a 26-year-old lawyer with a lifelong stammer climbed onto a table outside a small café in the gardens of the Palais Royal in Paris. His name was Camille Desmoulins. He had just heard that King Louis XVI had dismissed his finance minister, and in the crowded garden, surrounded by tables and chairs spilling out from a place called the Café de Foix, something in him broke loose. His stammer vanished. He tore a leaf from a chestnut tree, held it up as a symbol, and shouted for the people of Paris to take up arms. 2 days later, the Bastille fell. Most accounts of the French Revolution remember the mob, the prison, the storming of the walls. Almost no one remembers the café. But the café was where it started, and the drink on the table in front of Desmoulins and on the tables around him was coffee. This is not really a story about a bitter black drink that wakes people up in the morning. It is the story of how a wild shrub that grew quietly in the highlands of East Africa ended up present at the birth of revolutions, the birth of insurance companies and stock exchanges, the construction of railroads, the enslavement of millions of human beings, and the daily ritual of more than 2 billion cups consumed somewhere on Earth every single day. Coffee did not just travel around the world, it rearranged it. Before we go further, a quick aside. A lot of people watching this right now are watching on a television screen rather than a phone. And on a TV, the subscribe button is buried somewhere annoying instead of one easy tap away. If you don't mind hunting for it, subscribing genuinely helps a small channel like this keep making episodes like this one. And if a piece of this story surprises you in the next 20 minutes, sharing it with one person who'd find it interesting matters even more than the subscribe does. It's really the only way a channel like this grows. That's the whole ask. Back to the story. The honest answer to where coffee began is that nobody knows for certain. What is well established is the place, the forests of the Kaffa region in the southwestern highlands of what is now Ethiopia, where the coffee plant grows wild and where genetic studies show more natural diversity in coffee than anywhere else on the planet. The popular story attached to that origin is the legend of a goat herd named Kaldi, supposedly living around the 9th century, who noticed his goats becoming strangely energetic after chewing on the bright red berries of a certain bush. Curious, he tried them himself, felt the same jolt, and carried the berries to a nearby monastery, where the monks were skeptical until they discovered that the same berries kept them alert through long nights of prayer. It's a wonderful story, and it has been repeated for so long that it feels like fact. It almost certainly isn't, at least not in its specific details. The tale was first written down by a European scholar in Rome in 1671, nearly 8 centuries after it supposedly happened, and most historians treat it as folklore that nonetheless points to something true. Long before anyone wrote it down, communities in the Ethiopian highlands already understood that this plant did something to the body and the mind, sometimes pounding the berries with animal fat into a kind of primitive energy ball for travelers, long before anyone thought to brew it as a hot drink. The shift from chewed berry to brewed beverage seems to have happened across the Red Sea, in Yemen, sometime around the 15th century. It was the Sufi mystics there who get the most credit, using the dark, bitter liquid to stay awake through nights of devotional chanting, much as Ethiopian monks reportedly had. From their monasteries, coffee drinking moved into ordinary Yemeni life, and it moved through one port in particular, the city of Mocha, on Yemen's Red Sea coast, which became so thoroughly identified with the trade that for centuries afterward, Mocha simply meant coffee in much of the world, long before it meant a drink with chocolate in it. From Mocha, coffee crossed into Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest cities in Islam, and it was there that this small, ordinary plant first ran straight into political power. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, a man named Khair Beg, banned coffee outright. The official justification involved religious law and questions about whether the drink counted as an intoxicant. The real reason, by most historical accounts, was something closer to paranoia. Coffee houses were filling up with people talking, gossiping, and, worse, from a ruler's point of view, composing satirical verses about him. Beg had coffee sellers arrested and their stock burned in the street. The band didn't survive contact with the Sultan in Cairo, who reportedly had Beg removed from his post not long after and declared coffee an acceptable, even respected drink. It would not be the last time in this story that someone in power looked at a room full of people drinking coffee and saw a threat. Within a few decades, the Ottoman Empire had turned coffee into something close to a national institution. Coffee houses spread through Istanbul, Cairo, and Damascus, nicknamed schools of the wise, because so much conversation, storytelling, and argument happened inside them. By some estimates, 16th century Istanbul alone eventually held hundreds of them. The Ottomans were also the first to understand coffee's commercial value well enough to protect it. When they took control of Yemen's coffee trade in the 1530s, they reportedly parboiled the beans before export specifically, so the seeds could never germinate anywhere else. An early, low-tech form of an agricultural monopoly, centuries before anyone used that word. It didn't work forever. Monopolies on living plants rarely do. Around 1616, Dutch traders managed to get hold of living coffee plants and brought them home to greenhouses in Holland. At roughly the same time, according to a long-told story among coffee historians, an Indian Sufi pilgrim named Baba Budan smuggled fertile coffee seeds out of Arabia, strapped to his body during a pilgrimage, and planted them in the hills of Mysore in southern India. The seed, almost literally, of India's own coffee industry. Once the plant escaped Arabia's grip, its spread became a matter of decades rather than centuries. The Dutch began cultivating coffee on the island of Ceylon in 1658, and not long after on Java and Sumatra in the Dutch East Indies, which is the origin of another nickname still used today, when someone calls their coffee a cup of Java. Coffee reached Europe's cities at almost exactly the moment those cities were rethinking how knowledge, money, and power should move. The first coffee house on the European continent is generally dated to Venice in 1645. England followed soon after. A coffee house opened in Oxford in 1650. And in 1652, a Greek immigrant named Pasqua Rosé opened London's first coffee stall in a churchyard alley off Cornhill, in the heart of the city of London. The English at the time were, by most accounts, more or less perpetually mildly drunk. River water was unsafe, so weak ale and beer were the default daytime drink for centuries. Coffee offered something the taverns never had, a stimulant instead of a depressant, and a venue where business could actually be discussed with a clear head. London took to it fast. By 1663, the city had more than 80 coffee houses. By the early 1700s, estimates put the number above 500, more than any city in the Western world except Constantinople. Those London coffee houses didn't just sell a drink. They became the unlikely founding rooms of modern finance. Merchants, sea captains, and ship owners gathered at a coffee house run by a man named Edward Lloyd on Tower Street, trading news about ships, cargo, and risk. Informal conversations that, over time, hardened into the marine insurance market known today as Lloyd's of London. A few streets over, in Exchange Alley, stockbrokers who'd been thrown out of the Royal Exchange for rowdy behavior set up shop instead at a coffee house called Jonathan's, where buying and selling shares eventually evolved into the London Stock Exchange. Even the auction houses Sotheby's and Christie's trace their roots back to sales conducted out of coffee house back rooms. None of this was planned. It happened because coffee houses were cheap, open to almost any man who could pay a penny for a cup. Though, tellingly, not to women, who were barred from these penny universities, even as their husbands disappeared into them for hours at a stretch. That exclusion did not go unchallenged quietly. In 1674, a satirical pamphlet calling itself The Women's Petition Against Coffee circulated through London, claiming, tongue firmly in cheek, and almost certainly written by men poking fun at the whole controversy, that the drink was sapping Englishmen of their vigor and turning them into absent, jittery shadows of husbands. A counter-pamphlet answered just as sharply in coffee's defense. The fact that an entire small war of pamphlets broke out over a hot drink says something about how unsettling this new social habit felt to people at the time. Coffee unsettled rulers too. King Charles II of England tried briefly to shut English coffeehouses down in 1675, worried that they had become breeding grounds for political gossip and dissent against the crown. He backed down within days under public pressure. Continental Europe had its own version of the same anxiety, dressed in religious rather than political language. When coffee first reached Italy through Venetian trade, some Catholic clergy denounced it as the bitter invention of Satan, a drink of the Muslim world that no Christian should touch, according to a story repeated for centuries in coffee histories. The matter was settled when Pope Clement VIII himself tasted a cup sometime around 1600, found it delicious, and is said to have remarked that it would be a shame to let infidels have such a wonderful drink to themselves, effectively blessing it for Christian use. Like several stories in coffee's history, the details of this papal endorsement are impossible to verify with full certainty. But the underlying fact is solid. Coffee did cross from the Islamic world into Catholic Europe, and it did so without the lasting religious resistance many at the time expected. Vienna has its own legend, and it deserves to be told with the same honesty about its uncertain edges. According to a story that has circulated since at least the 19th century, after the failed Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683, the retreating Turkish army left behind sacks of green coffee beans, which a local figure, often named as Franz Georg Kolschitsky, supposedly used to open one of the city's first coffee houses, adding milk and sugar to suit Viennese taste. Historians who have looked closely at the record are skeptical of the specific hero and the specific abandoned sacks. What is much better documented is that Vienna's distinctive coffeehouse culture did take root in the years following 1683 and grew into something so central to the city's identity that, centuries later, UNESCO recognized Viennese coffeehouse culture as part of humanity's intangible cultural heritage. By the late 1600s, coffee had reached Paris, and it found its most famous home there in 1686 at a café opened by a Sicilian named Francesco Procopio dei Coltelli, across the street from the theater that would become the Comédie Française. Café Procope became the unofficial headquarters of the Enlightenment. Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu were regulars. Denis Diderot reportedly drafted articles of the Encyclopédie, the great Enlightenment project to catalog all human knowledge, at its tables. Benjamin Franklin is said to have spent time there too, decades before revolution broke out in his own country. When that French Revolution did arrive, the same café, by then sometimes called Café Zopi, became a meeting point for the radical Cordelier Club, where Georges Danton, Jean-Paul Marat, and Camille Desmoulins, the same stammering lawyer from the opening of this story, gathered to argue and plan in the years after the Bastille fell. Coffee did not cause the French Revolution, but the rooms where it was served, hour after hour, gave the revolution's key figures a place to sit, argue, and sharpen their ideas long before they ever took to the streets. Prussia produced one of the strangest chapters in this entire history. By the 1770s, coffee had become so popular across German lands that King Frederick the Great grew genuinely alarmed. Not over health or morality, but over money. Every sack of beans had to be imported, and he calculated that hundreds of thousands of thaler were leaving his treasury every year to pay for it. In a public proclamation issued in September 1777, Frederick complained that it was disgusting how much coffee his subjects were drinking, insisted his soldiers had always been raised on beer, and openly doubted that an army of coffee drinkers could be trusted to win a war. He turned coffee roasting into a state monopoly, restricted licenses mostly to the nobility, the clergy, and government officials, and priced ordinary coffee so high that the poor were pushed toward chicory, barley, and dried fig substitutes instead. When smuggling and home roasting continued anyway, Frederick hired roughly 400 disabled war veterans as official coffee sniffers, sending them out to walk the streets of Prussian towns, literally smelling the air for the telltale scent of illegally roasted beans coming from someone's kitchen. The scheme was deeply unpopular and never really worked. It quietly collapsed not long after Frederick's death in 1786. Across the cultural border in Leipzig, the composer Johann Sebastian Bach had already weighed in on the era's coffee obsession in his own way, writing a comic miniature opera around 1732, known today as the Coffee Cantata, about a stubborn young woman who flatly refuses to give up her 3 cups a day, declaring coffee sweeter to her than 1,000 kisses. A king tried to police the smell of coffee in the streets with spies. A composer turned the same craving into a punchline set to music. Both responses tell you how deeply and how fast this one drink had burrowed into ordinary daily life. Across the Atlantic, coffee found a different kind of political meaning, and it found it almost overnight. In December 1773, a group of American colonists boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped over 300 chests of British tea into the water in protest of taxes imposed without their consent. Tea, almost instantly, became politically radioactive. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail the following year, describing a moment when he asked an innkeeper for tea on the road and was told, flatly, that tea had been renounced in that house, but she could make him coffee instead. "I have drank coffee every afternoon since," Adams wrote, "and have borne it very well." Within a few years, coffee had become something close to a patriotic signal in the colonies that would become the United States. A small, daily, personal way of choosing a side in a much larger argument. The habit outlasted the war that inspired it and helped settle, centuries in advance. Why coffee rather than tea would become the default hot drink in American life? None of this expansion happened in a vacuum, and none of it was free of cost. As European demand for coffee exploded through the 1700s and 1800s, the question of who would grow it and under what conditions became one of the darkest chapters attached to any ordinary object this kind of story can cover. The French had already built a brutal coffee and sugar plantation economy on the island of Saint-Domingue, worked by enslaved Africans, before a revolution there in the 1790s overturned French colonial rule entirely and helped push coffee cultivation toward a new center, Brazil. According to an old and frequently repeated story, a Portuguese officer named Francisco de Melo Paleta traveled to French Guiana in 1727 on a diplomatic mission and returned to Brazil with coffee seeds obtained, the story goes, as a parting gift from the French governor's wife. A charming tale that, like several others in this history, is difficult to confirm in its romantic specifics, but is consistent with the broader, well-documented fact that coffee cultivation took hold in Brazil in roughly that period and never looked back. What followed was staggering in scale. By the 1830s, coffee had become Brazil's largest export. By the 1840s, Brazil alone was producing somewhere around 40% of the entire world's coffee, and that production was overwhelmingly built on the backs of enslaved people. Brazil became the largest single destination for the transatlantic slave trade of any country in the Americas. An estimated 4 million enslaved Africans were brought there over the centuries, with close to 1 million of those arrivals coming after the trade had technically, but not effectively, been outlawed in 1831. In Brazil's Paraíba Valley, between Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, hillsides were cleared and planted in endless geometric rows of coffee, anchored by grand plantation houses, and, just out of sight of polite company, the cramped slave quarters that housed the people who actually did the work. The town of Vassouras, at the heart of that valley, grew so wealthy from coffee in the 1850s and 1860s that it earned the nickname, the Little Princess of Coffee, home to more than 400 coffee estates at its peak. Brazil did not abolish slavery until 1888, with the signing of what is known as the Golden Law, making it the very last country in the Americas to do so. Even after abolition, many of the formerly enslaved workers and the European immigrants who replaced them on Brazilian coffee farms were locked into a system of company-stored debt that left them little freer in daily practice than they had been in law, paid in credit slips that often never quite covered what they owed. While Brazil was scaling coffee into an empire, on the other side of the world, A single fungus was about to erase one entirely. By the late 1860s, the island then called Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, had become one of the world's leading coffee exporters. Its hillsides cleared of rainforest in a rush so frenzied that planters at the time compared it to a gold rush. Then, in 1869, pale yellow spots began appearing on coffee leaves on an estate in the island's hill country. The culprit was a fungus called Hemilia vastatrix, coffee leaf rust, which planters nicknamed Devastating Emily. There was no cure. Within 2 decades, Ceylon's coffee industry, once a colonial powerhouse exporting roughly a third of Europe's coffee at its peak, had been reduced to almost nothing. And desperate planters tore out their dying coffee bushes and planted tea instead. One of the men who pioneered that switch, a Scottish planter named James Taylor working at the Lulakondera estate near Kandy, helped lay the groundwork for what the world now knows as Ceylon tea, meaning that a global tea brand most people have heard of exists today, largely because of a coffee disease most people have never heard of at all. Coffee's modern story carries its own quieter version of that same fragility. Through the 20th century, coffee became one of the most heavily traded commodities on Earth, behind only oil by some measures, with tens of millions of small farmers across Latin America, Africa, and Asia depending on its price for their survival. That price has never been stable, and at the end of the 1990s, it collapsed catastrophically. Coffee that had sold for roughly $1.09 a pound in 1998 was selling for under 50 cents a pound by 2002, driven down largely by a flood of new, cheap Robusta coffee out of Vietnam, whose production multiplied more than 20-fold in a little over a decade. For the people actually growing the coffee, the human cost was severe and immediate. In El Salvador, tens of thousands of coffee workers lost their jobs almost overnight, worsened by an earthquake that struck the same year. In Nicaragua, unemployed coffee workers and their families marched for days from the city of Matagalpa to the capital to demand government help. In parts of Mexico, farmers abandoned coffee plots that no longer paid enough to survive on, and some died attempting to cross into the United States in search of other work. In parts of Colombia, some farmers reportedly turned to growing coca instead of coffee, simply because it still paid. Out of that crisis grew the modern fair trade and specialty coffee movements. An attempt, still imperfect and still debated, to guarantee growers a price connected to what it actually costs to grow the crop, rather than to a number set by traders thousands of miles away, who have never seen the farm. Today, coffee is often estimated to be the most widely consumed prepared beverage on the planet after water, with well over 2 billion cups poured somewhere in the world on an average day. The corner coffee shop, the kind millions of people now treat as an extension of their living room or office, traces a fairly direct cultural line back to a small store opened in 1971 at Seattle's Pike Place Market. A shop that would eventually grow into the company most people now picture first when they hear the word coffee. And the same fragility that destroyed Ceylon's coffee industry in the 19th century has not gone away. It has simply changed shape. Climate researchers now warn that rising temperatures could shrink the amount of land suitable for growing high-quality Arabica coffee significantly within the coming decades. And the same leaf rust fungus that ended Ceylon's coffee story has already resurfaced in Central America in recent years, devastating farms in Guatemala, much as it once devastated an entire colonial economy on the other side of the world. It is strange, when you sit with all of this, to think about what coffee actually is. A cherry from a wild shrub, picked, dried, roasted, and ground into something that dissolves in hot water. There is nothing about the object itself that explains any of what it caused. It was never the coffee that built insurance companies or stock exchanges. Never the coffee that helped spark a revolution in a Parisian garden. Never the coffee that burned through Ceylon's hillsides or chained millions of human beings to plantations they never chose. The coffee just sat there, bitter and dark in a cup, while the people around it did all of that. Argued, conspired, exploited, rebuilt, suffered, and started over. The plant gave them a reason to sit in the same room for hours at a time, awake, alert, and talking. Everything else, for better and for considerably worse, came from what people did with that time. So the next time you're standing in line somewhere with a cup in your hand, waiting for your name to be called, it might be worth asking yourself a different kind of question than the one most people ask about their coffee. Not where the beans came from or how it was roasted, but what room you'd be sitting in right now and what you'd be talking about if this drink had never crossed the Red Sea at all. What's the most surprising thing you've learned today about something you drink without giving it a second thought?